Hi, Inalvis, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you and see you. How are you?
Good, and you? How's everything with you over there?
Good. So we have a good audience that wants to learn about this brand new assets contract that becomes effective in 5 days, I believe.
Yes, we're very close to the effective date. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to see that you were able to make it, and that I see, due to the number of participants, that you're very eager to learn about the new contract and the addendums and the changes. So I'm very happy to see that you were able to make it today.
Good. All right, so I'll let you go along, and I'll monitor from here. And any questions that come up or things that I think that I would like to highlight, I'll follow along. So
Okay.
the microphone is yours.
Okay. Before anything, and before I share the screen, I wanted to welcome you one more time. And I wanted to share a little bit about who I am for those of you that don't know me yet, and where I'm coming from and my company. I am an attorney. I'm a real estate attorney. I'm licensed in the state of Florida, as you know, and in the state of Illinois. I've been practicing in the real estate areas, aside from other areas, for the last 7 years. And I'm happy to be a part of two companies. The first one is Sanchez Badillo, which is a law firm. And the second one is Title Logic, which is a title company, which I hope that you have heard of already. And one of the attorneys on the real estate department. And the good thing about Title Logic is that it's a title company, which is partly owned and run by attorneys. That means that we're able to help you with most of the situations and issues that arises in a real estate transaction. I've been going to the offices this month and, previously. And actually, one of my goals is to get to know each one of you guys. So anything that you need, your branch managers, they have my cell phone, my car. I'm here to help you. So, and the reason why I'm telling you this is because I know that the contract, the changes are gonna cause a little bit in certain areas, I would say, some commotion, because of the way that we've been practicing. Is the way that we practice now is going to change a bit. So at some point in time, you're going to need somebody to ask questions. And I just wanted you to know that we're here to offer that support. Okay. Having said that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to show you a PowerPoint that we prepared for you guys. And as Ernesto said, if you have questions, feel free to let him know, and he's gonna he could interrupt at any time and ask questions. Okay. I'm very used to doing this in person, so to be quite honest, doing a webinar is a first to me. But I am very happy to be doing it right now, and to do it this way for you to have the information as well. But feel free to ask questions if you have questions, because the goal is for you to understand, not to be confused or to leave the webinar without knowing what you need to know. Okay, so let me share my screen a minute. I think that you could all see the screen now. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the changes before I discuss them in details. Okay, so you're going to see changes to the ASIS contract, which is the contract that we mostly use in Florida, and you mostly use as real estate agents. You're also going to see the same changes in the residential contract. So whatever was modified in the ASIS, it was modified in the residential as well. So for example, if there's a definition that was modified in one, the same applies to the other one. I just wanted to point that out because many people ask me, Ina, is it the same? Is it not the same? What do I do about this? So the changes are the same, okay? Then you have 7 addendums that you currently have and you use that were modified. Some of them were modified a little bit, that the consequences are very less. I mean, you don't need to worry much about them. Some of them were modified a bit, and you might need to start using those addendums. So we're going to go ahead and discuss the modifications of the addendums as well, okay? And they include the HOA rider, the FHA BA addendum, pre-closing, post-closing occupancy, the addendum that may set a contingent for the buyer to sell their current property to be able to sell the one that they're buying, the backup contract addendum, and the right to inspect and cancel. And then you have 3 new addendums, which you're going to have to read and get familiar with, because in some instances, you're going to be required to add them to the contract. And those have to do with seasonal and vacation rental, base addendum, and the mold inspection. Okay, we're going to start with the contracts, the modification of the contracts first, and then we're going to go into the addendums. So whenever we talk about the contracts, the first thing that the board did is that they come and they start considering the fact that a lot of houses nowadays, and you know, they're more techy. And the reality is that right now everybody has a Nest in the house. They have, you know, all these devices that control certain things in the houses, that the lights, you know, we have Alexa, we have Google. So we have now a contract that takes into consideration these things, right? So the first thing that they do is that they come and in the personal property section of the contract, they removed the intercom, which is something that properties used to have a lot in Florida. So they removed that and it's nowhere in the definition now. So having said that, if you do have a property that has intercom and they're included, then you now what you have to do is you have to do the reverse. Now you have to add it as part of the personal property that should be included in with the purchase, okay? And then the other thing that they do is that they come and they take into consideration all these things that have to do with technology. So they come and they add thermostats, which is a big one because, and this is something that you have to tell your clients, because now we're thinking about, for example, the Nest. Many people have Nest, and before closing, they just come and they disconnect it and they take it with them. If the Nest was there whenever you do when the showing happened, then this is something that you might not do anymore, because the personal property definition mentions that thermostats are now included. So what should you do then before the showing? What you recommend your client is to change it or exclude it in the contract, because right now it's part of the definition. Then the same thing is going to apply to doorbells. The same is going to be applied to television, but not the TV, actually, the wall mounts, and the mailbox keys, and some protection items like hurricane panels and hardware. Okay, the hurricane panels right now, the reality of it is that most properties, whenever you buy the property, they come with the panels. But by adding it to the definition, they're making sure that the seller is not going to simply go ahead and take away, you know, the panels from the buyer at closing. So this is something that right now is included in the contract and is serious. It's not something that is up in the air, that is subject to interpretation as probably before. So the more that you tell your client all these things from the beginning, the less issues you have the day of the closing whenever they do the walkthrough and they find that, you know, probably the seller took away certain things. There's other items like when I go to the classes, I always tell you about that they are not included in the personal property definitions. For example, if you have a property where the washer and the dryer and the microwave, they're included as part of personal property, These three items are not included within the personal definition, the personal property definition. So what do you have to do? I always recommend that you write it in the section of the contract, you write it in as part of the personal property. And the same you're gonna do with certain things that might not be part of the personal property definition, but the seller is willing to leave to the buyer after the closing. Okay, so this is something that you definitely have to keep in mind from now on. Then we move to the purchase price definition of what purchase price is. There's no real change or, you know, major change in what purchase price is. That's the reality of it. What the change that they did is that they're emphasizing what collected means, okay? And let me explain to you a little bit about what collected means and the collection process, okay? Every time that a buyer gives money to, in this case, a closing agent, right? Whether it is in the form of a check, whether it is in the form of a wire transfer, whether it is in the form of a cashier check. The reality of it is that there's a process that the bank follows, which is called the collection process, where the bank has to check the source of the funds, the source of the money. You know, they want to make sure that the money, the funds that the buyer is sending or giving, they're legit. So that's called a process of a collection process. So what do? It's a process within the banks where they check the source of the funds, they check that the funds are available, and until they're able to check that, the funds are not really collected, okay? Once the process is done, that's where the funds are the so-called collected funds, okay? I explain this to you because there's a conception or, you know, everybody tells me, hey, Ina, you're telling me this, but for example, I'm giving you a cashier check. How can you tell me that the money that I'm giving you, you know, is not collected when I'm giving you a cashier check? Well, the reality of it is that even with a cashier check, when I deposit the cashier check, my bank has to do the collection process. They have to check that cashier check. They have to make sure that the funds used to buy the cashier check are legitimate funds, you know, and they're funds that my bank are able to go ahead and finalize the collection process and collect it and put it in my account 100% in a way that they're never going to be able to take it out. So what happens is that if that doesn't happen, the money comes into my account, and within days, the bank is going to remove, is going to deduct the funds from my account, okay? If the funds are not legit. That's the collection process or funds collected. Why is this a big deal? You know, it's not because the banks have to do the process. It's because later on in the contract, you know, a few clauses after, they define what closing date is. And now we start seeing a little bit of a difference of what closing day is from today. So a week from now, a week and a half from now, you know, November 1st, the definition of closing date is going to be a little bit different. And I'm going to tell you what it's going to be. Closing day is going to be when the closing agent, okay, and I'm going to repeat it again, closing agent has all the documents that they need to have for the transaction. That means that the closing agent is going to have all the documents from the buyer, okay, the documents that the buyer has to sign, which include the documents that the lender requires to give the loan. And the closing agent is going to have the original documents from the seller. That means the warranty deed and all the documents that the seller signs at closing. In addition to that, the closing agent, and again, the closing agent is going to have, has to have all the funds pertaining to the closing collected in their bank account. That means that when, for example, TitleLogic, my company, has all the documents from the buyer, all the documents from the seller, all the funds from the lender, and all the funds from the buyer, and the funds are collected in my account, That's what closing day means. And technically speaking, if we go and we guide ourselves by this definition, that means that at that point in time, the seller could give the keys to the buyer. That's a change, because right now, the practice is that the seller only releases the key to the buyer the moment that the seller receives the funds in their account. This is going to be the first, I think, kind of like big change that we're going to see, where it's going to cause a little bit of a commotion at first, because not everybody knows that this is changing and the practice is going to change. And when the practice of, the practice that we've been having for years and years and years change, then we have to educate other parties a lot. And I think that's the advantage that you guys as agents of Canvas are having by being able to have these classes ahead of time. Now you know that the system is going to change. That means that if I called you and I tell you I have all the money in my account collected and I have all the documents, that means that probably your buyer, if you're the buyer, if you represent the buyer, could get the keys at that moment when I made the call, because I'm the closing agent. You don't have to wait for the seller to receive the funds anymore. This is a change, because think about the scenario where you close at 4:30 p.m. on a long weekend. And right now there's a lot of issues because you close at 4:30, the seller is never gonna get the money until probably Tuesday. Let's say it's a long weekend, Monday the banks are closed. They're never gonna get the money until Tuesday. And most of the times we had the buyer wanting to get possession of the property right away, and then they have the long weekend in between, and they can never get possession until Tuesday. Based on this definition, that's going to change, and the buyer is going to be able to get their keys 4:30 Friday, whenever the closing agent has everything that they need for closing, okay, to meet the closing date definition. And this is something that we're going to see how it goes. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I think it's a good change. I am worried as an attorney. I have certain things that I think ahead of times, and I get a little bit concerned with the seller part of it, because I do represent sellers as well, and there might be potential issues with the seller. For example, and I don't want to scare you, but let's think of a scenario where the seller, for some reason, fraud, something like that, something crazy, that they don't receive their funds. And all of a sudden you have a seller that do not have the property anymore. They don't have access to it. They haven't been able to collect the proceeds from the sale. And they pretty much don't have anything, and what they do have is a huge issue in their hands, trying to resolve a situation with fraud or something like that. This is me thinking ahead, not to scare you. What I always recommend is that in the event that you represent a seller, verify the seller's account several times. Closing agents and we as Title Logic, we call the seller 3 times before sending a wire. We confirm their bank account several times. So this is something that I don't foresee happening all the time. But as an attorney, I always have that concern, what could happen with the seller, thinking from the other angle. From the buyer's perspective, I do believe it's a good change, but let's see how it goes. And then there's a clause which is typically is actually clause 5 of the contract. When you look at that clause, that's a clause which goes with financing. Okay, and right now, I'm sure you are aware that whenever you get financing, the banks, they have their own regulations. And what happens sometimes is that closing day comes, your buyer gets approved, but the day of closing, although the bank has what is called a clear to close or final approval, the bank tells you, I do have the clear to close, but I cannot close it because I had to give what the CD, the closing disclosure, to the buyer, and I had to wait 3 days. That's the regulation of the bank. That's true. The banks will have to wait the 3 days to be able to proceed to closing. And that's precisely why you have a clause in the contract that says that if that happens, okay, if by any reason your closing date, you have to close today, and you have this scenario where the bank is ready, but bank cannot close because they have to wait the 3 days, then the contract, the closing day automatically stands right now is up to 10 days, okay? And see how I say up to, because it's gonna extend automatically up to the number of days that the bank needs to proceed to closing, okay? So if the bank needs 3 days, it's gonna extend up to 3 days. If the bank needs 7 days, it's gonna extend up to 10 days, okay? That's up to there, we're good. The only change that they're making to this clause is that you are not gonna have 10 days anymore. You're gonna have up to 7 days. Okay, so from 10, you're gonna have, they reduce it to 7 days. I do not foresee that this is gonna cause a huge problem, because the reality of it is that the banks, the regulation says that they have to wait 3 days to be able to close, and you should have enough time with 7 days to be able to do the closing, okay? But they did change the clause. It went down from 10 to 7 days. This is a good clause for you to keep in mind, because most of the times what happens is that closing day comes, you have the situation with the bank, you go to the seller tells you, you know what, I'm not gonna give you the extension. And obviously you're trying to get the extension because we, we want to be cautious, and we go to the seller and we ask for the extension. But then you could use this clause where there is an automatic extension, and you don't need the seller to be able to extend the contract. The contract extends automatically, and you're able to close later on. Okay, so this is a good clause to remember, but it has to be, it only applies under the circumstances that I just explained. It doesn't apply all the time, okay? Then clause 6 of the contract, this is a clause that I always recommend, or I always say in the classes that I teach, that you need to select that option if the property is rented. And if the person that is living in the property, meaning the tenant, is going to stay in the property, the person is going to stay after the closing, okay? Meaning the property is subject to a tenant. When that happens, you're supposed to select the box that you have in clause 6 of the contract, okay? And that pretty much tells the buyer that they're buying a property with the tenant. They're not going to be able to use the property, after the closing, until the tenant decides to leave, okay, or the lease terminates. Now, what they did with the clause is that, remember that I told you at the beginning that now we have a short-term rental and vacational rental addendum. What they did is that they're now saying that if the property is subject to a lease or a short-term rental or a seasonal rental, then you have to select the clause. You select it, and this is how it works. If you have a lease, okay, lease agreement, normal lease agreement, remember that you have to get during the transaction, you're supposed to get from the tenant a tenant stop letter, okay? The stop letter is a document that the tenant is going to fill out and sign, that is going to confirm all the terms of the lease. And the closing agent is going to ask you for that, to confirm that whether there is a security deposit, a last month that the tenant paid. We want to also make sure that there's no issues between the tenant and the seller, things like that, okay? The tenant stop letter is going to continue to apply to a lease agreement. However, if you have a short-term rental or vacational rental, you are not required to get tenant stop letters for those. And that makes sense, because think about it this way. Short-term rentals and vacational rentals, they typically work with reservations. I could be reserving a property that I'm going to be staying at, for 3-4 days next year. and I'm reserving it right now. If that property is being sold, does it make sense that the seller has to come to me that I'm renting a year from now to ask for an stop letter? It doesn't make sense. So the clause change, to include this type of tenancies, the short-term rentals, but they made sure to clarify that in these scenarios, you don't have to get an stop letter. However, it continues to apply to a lease agreement, okay? So that didn't change. Okay, then we go to clause 7 of the contract. Clause 7 is the clause that includes everything that has to do with an assignment of the contract. Okay, you have a buyer that they are going to assign the contract to somebody else, or the most common scenario is that the buyer is buying the property under their personal name, but they're going to open a company and then they're going to transfer the contract to the company. Okay, this is the assignment clause. You have 3 options in that clause. Okay, you have the option to assign, 2 options to assign, and then they discuss liability. And then you have the option where the seller does not let you assign the contract. Right now, okay, the standard is that if you leave the clause blank, meaning you do not select any options, okay, that means that the contract is assignable. The buyer could go and assign the contract, okay? Starting November 1st, is gonna be the reverse, okay? You must select an option. If you do not select one of the 3 options, okay, that's gonna mean that the buyer cannot assign the contract, okay? So we're moving from right now, you leave blank, buyer could assign the contract, to in the future, November 1st, you leave blank, buyer cannot assign the contract. And this is something that I want to make sure that first you understand, and second, you make a note that you always, from now on, starting November, you make sure that you select the right choice for your client. Because if you happen to leave a blank and you have a client that wants to close under the name of a company, then look at what's going to happen. You leave the clause blank, right? Then closing comes. Your client really wanted to close under the name of the company, but because you leave the clause blank, it means that it's not assignable. Let's say that the seller, doesn't want to cooperate with you, and you're not able to get the seller to agree to assign the contract, because negotiations are always possible, right? But this seller said no. So the fact that you didn't select the option in the clause has made your client close the transaction under his personal name, okay? That means that if your client wants, really wants that property to be under the name of a company, I'm using this scenario, but let's say under the name of somebody else, that's another possibility. What we have done is that we have made our client, okay, close under the personal name. That's not what the client wanted. And then in order for them to get the property under the name of the company or somebody else's name, they have to do another process in it in itself. They might have to do a quick claim deed, and that comes with certain expenses. And if your client got finance to buy the property, they pay documentary stamps and intangibles because they have a mortgage. When they go and do the quick claim deed, aside from the fact that technically speaking, the mortgage might say that they cannot change the title of the property, right? The client is going to have to pay documentary stamps again. So they're having the fee, the cost double, just because we forgot or we didn't fill out the form. So I'm taking the time to explain this to you for you to understand how, the consequences of not filling out the contract correctly, okay? That is fixable, yes, it is. That you could do the quick claim deed, absolutely. but that it has consequences. Yes, it does. So you as agents and me as an attorney, we need to pay attention to these little details, you know, to help our clients. Okay, now we're gonna move into the section of the contract where they actually change the most, you know, and the practice is gonna change quite a bit because of the changes that they made to this clause. And some of the changes that they made, it takes quite a bit to understand 100%. So what I usually do is that I explain it, I repeat it, and I try to give examples. Okay, so that's what I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna go slowly, and I'm gonna explain it again, because I even though I'm not seeing all of you, I foresee that this is gonna cause questions, you know, and concerns. But let me start with the first change, which is not really a change, okay? The financing section of the contract is clause A of the contract. You had two options. You had the option of proceeding as a cash transaction, or you had the option of getting financing. Up to there, we're good. It's the same, okay? The clause 8A is the clause that considers that you're gonna close with a cash transaction. They made changes to that clause. What they did is they deleted most of the language of the clause, and all they're saying now is that you're gonna close with cash. Technically speaking, no change whatsoever, okay, on that one. So you don't really need to worry much about that one. If you select that one, your buyer is gonna close with cash, no problem whatsoever. Now, let's talk about the financing one, because that's the one that brings the changes. Your financing contingency right now, which is the same as your loan approval period, comes now with two aspects, okay? What do I mean by that? For you to have a loan approval, you have to have, one, the loan approved with the terms that you included in the contract, okay? Plus, you have to have an appraisal or valuation satisfactory to the lender, okay? Satisfactory to the lender, and that it meets the requirements of the lender. So again, you have to have the loan, the financing, approved under the terms that you are including in the contract, plus you have to have the appraisal or the valuation satisfactory to the lender to meet the requirements of the lender, okay? So it did change. Right now-
Can I jump in there for a second?
Sure, go ahead.
Because that is the question that's since we began to do these classes, and I'm so glad that you guys are doing these classes because everybody is confused, and this is the number one topic that everybody asks about.
Yeah.
So because I was just talking to Ruben before jumping in the Zoom. So what they're not looking, the contract is not looking for a clear to close, correct?
It's not saying clear to close.
It's not a clear to close. It's an approval with conditions that they're looking for, right? Yeah.
I'm gonna go to the contract, but it's not mentioning the term clear to close. It's not mentioning the term final approval.
No, it's an approval. It's the approval that they get with condition. Yeah. The only condition that the contract is requiring that it was not required for is the appraisal evaluation has to be done before that. But I mean, it could still be subject to verifying verify 4506 from the IRS, verification of employment, yeah, you know, all of that good stuff, right?
Absolutely. We're not saying here that you know, the only condition is going to be the appraisal. No. What they're saying is that now during the contingency period of financing, the appraisal is included. Okay. The technicality of it is that right now we know that the lender is going to request an appraisal if it is required, because many lenders are not requiring appraisal, or they're not going to require appraisals any longer in the future. You know, they're going to do valuation systems, you know, that they're working on, and that seems to be the future. But right now, the contingency does not include appraisal. That's the reality of it. That the bank requires it and requests it, and they should get it within the approval. Yes, because that's something that is a contingent that the bank has. But the reality of it is that it's not included within the financing contingency right now. What they're doing is that they're saying that during this time, you need to have your approval with whatever conditions, as you said, for 4506, insurances, whatever conditions that, you know, the lender is going to require. In addition, you need to have the appraisal within that time. Yeah, and then if
So did everybody understand that? Did everybody understand that? Because I'm looking to see if there's any questions. I don't see any questions on the chat. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that. So it's not a clear to close. We're not looking, the contract is not looking for a clear to close, but the contract is looking for an approval. So the issue is that Inalvis, after this date, the money is the.
You're breaking, Ernesto, and I couldn't hear the last question. The last part of your question.
That after this day is the contract is, I mean, that's it. The money is non-refundable, right?
Yeah, after this day, the money is not refundable. So look at what happens, you know, because we're talking about clear to close now, and the contract is not clear. It has never been clear that you have to have final approval, which is the so-called clear to close, you know. The reality of it is that, look at what happens. If you get to this date, they say November 15, okay, and on November 15, you got your approval subject to a few conditions, okay, whatever conditions, and you got your appraisal, and the appraisal is satisfactory to the lender, no problem there, but you do have your approval and you have quite a few conditions, okay? That means you're not clear to close November 15. You're not. So you don't have a final approval, right? The contract doesn't require that you have a final approval per se in the language of the clause. But if you, by November 15, want to go ahead and make sure that the deposit of the buyer is safe, and you still have conditions to satisfy, I recommend that you get an extension. Because what's going to happen is that if you don't get the extension, and then those conditions cannot be satisfied by the buyer, then and the seller is going to be able to come and claim the deposit if you cannot close. So you see what I'm saying? Even though the contract does not say anywhere that it has to be final approval, clear to close, okay? As a matter of practice and as a matter of, you know, being cautious, you are going to think about it as that day, your loan approval day, you should have your final approval, your clear to close, okay? And that's something that is important for you to know. You know what I do, and that goes into a couple of points after that I'm going to make about the financing contingency and the notices that you have to give to the seller. The option that you got here is that comes November 15, that's our deadline. You have your appraisal, you're good to go. You have your approval, subject to, I don't know, like a few conditions, okay? Your buyer does not want to extend the financing contingency because your buyer is secure that they're going to get the loan and they're going to close with the loan, then you could let it go. You don't have to extend, okay? But that's a decision that your buyer is going to have to make, not us as an attorney, or I wouldn't recommend you make it for your client, okay? Because if something were to happen where your client does not get that clear to close prior to the closing, you know, and they don't get the loan, then they are going to be, that deposit is going to be subject to the seller claiming it because they didn't meet the financing contingency and you didn't extend the time, okay? So it's important that you understand this. Is approval plus the appraisal. It doesn't say anywhere clear to close, okay? But as a matter of practice and to be cautious, I would recommend that by your deadline, you will have your final approval for the loan and your appraisal, and that the lender had already reviewed the appraisal, okay? And the lender had already approved that appraisal, because keep in mind that the clause says satisfactory to the lender, okay? In order to meet lender's requirement. So you do want, by the deadline, that the lender has already confirmed that that appraisal satisfies the requirement and it is satisfactory to the lender. Okay, is that clear, Ernesto? Do you have any questions? I cannot see the questions that they're coming in. Okay, I guess I'll continue, and if you guys have any questions, come back. What I could do is I could also, you're not gonna have the contract in front of you, but I could read the clause for you to see what the clause says. Give me a second and I'll read it. Okay, the contract, the clause, you're always gonna see a clause 8b, and it says, this contract is contingent upon, okay, and then within, you have to put the number of days. If you leave blank, then it's 30 days after effective date. That equals loan approval period, okay, and then goes buyer obtaining approval of a, and then it's a typical clause that says conventional FHA, BA, or other mortgage loan for the purchase of the property for a, and then it tells you fixed or adjustable rate in the loan amount at an initial interest rate not to exceed whatever percentage, okay? If left blank, then prevailing rent, and for a term of, then you have the number of years, and two, buyer's mortgage broker or lender having received an appraisal or alternative valuation of the property satisfactory to the lender, if either is required by lender, which is sufficient to meet the terms required for lender to provide financing for buyer and proceed to closing. Okay, so again, the clause is not gonna, it doesn't mention anything about clear to close or final approval, but an indication of the fact that you should always have your final approval at the time of the deadline is that the clause says, which is sufficient to meet the terms required for lender to provide financing for buyer and proceed to closing. Okay, so the fact that it says proceed to closing, you could take it as an indication that it has to be or should be 100% approved, okay, where there's no contingencies that they're not going to allow you to proceed to closing. So that's clause A, B. Okay, when you get the contract in front of you, I'm sure you're going to get the contract November 1st. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and send the PowerPoint and the attachment with the contracts to Ernesto for them to share it with you, the persons that are here in the webinar, okay? Then let's move on, because the financing contingency, there are a bunch of changes, and if you have questions, jump in, okay? Then from that, they go a little bit into talking about good faith and diligent efforts. And then look at this. The contract says, buyer must make good faith and diligent efforts to meet the deadline, obtain appraisal, and close thereafter. Good faith and diligent efforts means, and this is something that we have to keep in mind, timely provide all information and documents needed and paying for appraisal and other fees and charges. So the buyer is required to provide all the documentation needed by the mortgage broker and by the lender, and to pay for all the fees and costs related to the loan that are required to be paid upfront, including the appraisal. The reason why we believe that they're adding the good faith and diligent effort to the contract is because right now we have many events where the buyers are not really acting in the good faith and they're not doing their best effort to get the loans, okay? So what happens is that they're delaying the process. They start the financing approval process, they started late, they don't pay the appraisals whenever they're supposed to be paying them. That delays the lender, that's delayed the mortgage brokers. So they're coming back saying that if the buyer does not use the good faith and diligent efforts, then that means that the buyer is going to be defaulting the contract, okay? I keep getting a lot of questions as to how does the seller knows? How would the seller know that the seller is not, that the buyer, I'm sorry, is not acting in good faith and diligent effort? Well, when we look at the clause of financing, there's a section that we're going to talk about it in a minute that says that the seller could request written notice, okay, written updates of the financing period to the buyer. And if the seller requests the written notifications and updates, that means that the buyer is required to give the updates to the seller, okay? The buyer is going to continue to have the responsibility to keep the seller, in this case, seller or seller's agent or seller's attorney, updated as to the process of the loan. That's a way of finding out that the buyer is acting in good faith and diligent effort. You're going to see the language of good faith and diligent effort again. Okay. I believe I have questions. Let me, before I continue, let me answer the questions. Okay. Actually, I had an open question and I lost it. I think that the one that I had is that if I'm going to send the material, yes, I'm going to share the material with you guys. Probably not send them myself personally because I don't have your emails right now, but I am going to send it to Corina and Ernesto, and I'm sure they're going to go ahead and send it to you. That way you have the PowerPoint slides, and you're also going to have the actual contracts, okay, with the modifications. So you're going to be able to read the clause and see the red lines of the modifications, okay? So let's keep in mind the good faith and diligent efforts. And now let's keep that in the back of our minds. Let's continue, okay? Because there's another session that we have to discuss then. Look at what they're doing. Loan approval that comes, okay, with a contingency that the buyer has to sell the property that they live in, and you did not include the rider number 5, which is the rider that says that this contract is contingent on buyers selling the property that they own right now, okay? Loan approval that comes with that contingency of the sale of the buyer house, and you did not include the rider to the contract. That means that is no loan approval. Okay, this one causes a bit of a commotion and a lot of questions. So let me explain to you. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. I have an apartment. Right now, I live in an apartment. I am buying a 3-home house. I'm sorry, a 3-bedroom house. Okay, so I'm upgrading. This happens a lot. In order for me to be able to buy my 3-bedroom house, I need to sell my apartment because I cannot pay both at the same time, okay? So the technicality of it is that when we prepare the contract, okay, when you prepare the contract or I prepare the contract as an attorney, I prepare the contract for the 3-bedroom house, right? But I should attach an addendum, which we're gonna discuss the addendum later on, that the addendum states that this purchase of the 3-bedroom house is contingent on the sale of my apartment. That's an addendum that should be attached to this contract. Now, I go and I apply for financing, I get my loan approved, and I get one condition or two conditions or three, but one of the conditions that I get is that I have to sell my apartment, okay, for me to be able to get the loan. If at the time that I did the contract, that we prepared the contract, we included the addendum that says that I had to sell my apartment and that the purchase of the 3-bedroom house was contingent on selling the apartment, okay, I added that addendum, then I'm good to go. I have my loan approval, I just have a few conditions that I have to satisfy. I'm fine, but look at what they're doing, okay? They're saying that if I have the loan approval with the contingency that I had to sell my house, and whenever I prepare my contract, I did not include that addendum that says that this contract of the 3-bedroom house is contingent on me selling my apartment, okay? If I didn't include that addendum, then that loan approval with contingency equals no loan approval. So loan approval with contingency, no addendum equals no loan approval, okay? That means that if we forgot to include Rider 5 to the contract in this scenario, okay, the loan approval that my client is gonna get as a buyer is, and if that loan approval is subject to the sale of the other house, is no loan approval. I'm not sure why they did this, and it is confusing, but it's loan approval with that contingency and no rider, no loan approval. What does that mean? If you have no loan approval, under the eyes of, you know, based on the terms of the contract, you have no loan approval, what options do you have as a buyer, right? So at that point in time, if I'm gonna take it as it is in the contract, and I have no loan approval, okay, then I had two options. I had the option of canceling the contract because I'm taking it exactly as the contract is stating that I have no loan approval. I cancel the contract. Why? Because if I have no loan approval and I proceed, that means that something happened with my lender and my loan, okay? And because to the eyes of the contract and the seller, I have no loan approval, I cannot close in cash, then I have to cancel the contract. Or two, then the other option that I have is take a risk. What is the risk? Technically speaking, the bank is approving me subject to the sale, even though my contract is not subject to the sale, okay? So I will be taking the risk of proceeding to closing, where if I do not sell the apartment, okay? I'm not gonna get the loan, and I'm gonna have to sell, and I'm gonna have to buy this one regardless. The 3-bedroom apartments, the 3-bedroom house, I'm gonna have to buy it regardless. I take the risk or I cancel, because the reality of it is that I have loan approval subject to the sale of the property. Without the rider, I have no loan approval. Why am I making a big deal out of this? Well, because who prepares the rider? Who prepares the addendum? We do. I prepare it as an attorney if I'm doing the contract for my client, and you prepare it as an agent if you're preparing the contract for your buyer. So how are we gonna know? The reality of it is that is what I always say. You have to know your client. The best way possible to protect your client is knowing your client. If you have a client in this situation, include the rider. Is it gonna be difficult for the seller to accept it? Absolutely. The seller, the moment that they see a rider that is making their transaction subject to something else, they're not gonna like it. That's the reality of it. The seller might not accept the rider. But if the seller does not accept it, then that's a decision that your buyer is gonna have to make, not you. What you could do is protect your buyer and add the addendum, because if you don't, it has consequences, okay? That's why I'm explaining it, and I'm trying, you know, for you to understand it. Okay, then let's move. I know I have a question about written notice. Let me talk about written notice right now, because, you know, we're gonna see that the reading part of it is everywhere. And then I'll go back to the question, and you know, I'll explain it again if it needs, if I need to explain. And I feel that if I explain the situation with the written notice first, then I'll be able to address the question better. Okay, so look at what happens during the process. If the seller comes and asks from the buyer, and when I speak about seller, keep in mind that it is the seller's agent or seller's attorney, which, you know, they're representatives of the seller. Okay, we talk about buyer and seller, but the reality of it is we always go back to seller's attorney, seller's agent, buyer attorney, buyer's agent. Okay, so keep that in mind. If the seller comes and requests reading updates about the financing, this is what I was talking about before. Okay, the buyer or the buyer's agent, whoever, you know, they are required to maintain the seller or seller's broker fully informed about the appraisal, about any property related condition, and about the loan approval. This is what I was talking to you about before, that I kept telling you. And I told you, how is it that the seller knows if the buyer is acting in good faith and diligent effort? How do they know? Well, because now they have the ability of asking in writing for updates, and that means that the buyer has to keep them updated. That doesn't mean that the seller has to come and ask you for updates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, you know, along the way. No, the moment that they ask you for updates in writing the first time, the buyer has the responsibility of keeping the seller informed. That's how they will know. Okay, so now the question that whenever I started reviewing these contracts, the question that I had was, is it all about writing? Is it all about written notice? And let's think about it, because look at this. If the buyer gets approval of the loan, okay, this is the best scenario. Loan is approved, buyer got the loan, right? Right now, what you need to do is, the moment that you get approved, if you get approved today, even if you have 5 days more or 10 days for the financing period, you got approved today, you're required to give notice to the seller today, okay? That's how the law and the contract works right now. Starting November 1st, you get approval today, you don't have to give notice today. You have all the way to the loan, to the loan approval period, the financing period deadline, to give your notice. However, you have to give the notice in writing. Okay, it's not going to be noticed verbally. It's not going to be noticed anymore through WhatsApp, to text messages. That's not going to happen anymore. That's not going to be acceptable. It has to be noticed in writing, you know, in the ways that the contract, and we're going to talk about notices later on, the contract allows for, via email. Okay, even though this is probably not going to be the way that people are going to do it, via a formal letter. Okay, but you have to give written notice to the seller. You do have for the way up to the financing deadline. Okay, you don't have to give notice today if you still have 15 days. But the moment that you do give notice, give it in writing. The second scenario, okay, you have your financing period ending today. Your buyer, and we spoke about this one earlier, your buyer decides that they're going to take the risk. They're not going to request an extension of the financing period. They're sure that they're going to be able to close with the loan. They're going to take the risk and they're going to move forward, okay, to closing. They're going to continue to closing. They're not going to ask an extension. They're going to let the deadline expires and they're going to continue. Okay, This happens all the time today. Guess what? The buyer has to give written notice to the seller of this decision. Even though it's a decision that the buyer is taking, you know, it's a risk that the buyer is taking. So buyer has to tell the seller in writing, I haven't been fully approved, okay, but I'm sure and confident that I'm gonna finalize the transaction and I'm gonna get my loan at the end, okay? I had to give it, I'm gonna proceed. It has to be in writing, okay? And the third scenario there's actually a third scenario and there's a fourth one, okay, which is a new one. The third scenario is you are at your financing contingency period today, right? You're not approved. You have to give written notice to the seller that you're not approved. That one doesn't change much, okay? But you have to make sure that it's written notice. Then the fourth one is one that right now is kind of like it's not 100% defined, okay? And this is the scenario where you have a loan approval, meaning you have a loan approval, but you have one or two contingencies that you cannot meet. No matter what you do, you cannot provide the evidence to the lender for the lender to say, yeah, I'm fine with the proof that you're providing to me, okay? So you have a loan approval subject to conditions, and you cannot meet the conditions no matter what you do, okay? And yes, this happens, okay? I'm gonna give you an example, okay? And let's say, for example, that you have a buyer that is a foreigner, and the buyer is here in the United States, and they got to the United States due to political asylum, okay? Now they're residents of the United States, and they've been here, I don't know, a number of years, therefore they're able to get the loan. They've been working in the United States and everything. But for some reason, you know, the bank decides that they want to verify their identity. Something happens with their names, something happens, right? And for some reason, the bank decides that they want to have a birth certificate. And that birth certificate have to come from the agency that gives birth certificates in the person's country, okay? The person cannot travel to their country. They cannot go and get the birth certificate because they cannot go back, because if they're here with political asylum, it's usually because, you know, they're scared to live in the country because something happens. They try to get the birth certificate any possible way, and they couldn't get it. They don't have a copy of it here. And I'm going to the extreme, trying to illustrate, you know, the situations that could happen, and this might not even arise in any transaction, okay? The reality of it that the buyer has tried to do everything possible to meet the contingency, but the bank, unless he produces that birth certificate or something that the bank is willing to accept, he's not going to be able to meet the contingency. So now you have a client that is approved, but he cannot meet the contingency, so you're never going to be able to get that clear to close, right? Or that final approval. And because you're never going to be able to get the final approval, that client is never going to be able to close with a loan. So the contract now allows for that scenario, and it tells you that if you have a client with that scenario, a buyer, the buyer has to give written notice to the seller of this situation, okay? And he could cancel the contract. Nowadays, this is something that is not clearly defined in the contract, you know, and that we have a lot of buyers and sellers fighting all the time because the seller, with all reasons, tells the buyer, but you told me you were approved. Now all of a sudden you told me that you're missing X, you know, and you're telling me that you're not fully approved. And then we have this situation where we have, you know, buyers and sellers buyer trying to cancel, seller does not want to cancel the contract, trying to claim the deposit, and it's a nightmare. So what they did with this scenario, with this new change, is that they took into consideration this scenario, and it gave the opportunity to the buyer to cancel the contract if something like this happens, that they cannot meet the conditions. okay? But look at what happens. If you notice, I made sure I emphasize the fact that in every single scenario, didn't matter the scenario, okay? The buyer had to give written notice to the seller. Why? Because if the buyer doesn't give written notice to the seller, look at what the contract is doing. The contract now has a clause that says that silence, meaning no written notice, equals cash. So what happens is that you take the contract from a contract with a financing contingency to a contract that has no financing contingency, is a cash contract, okay? So you are, by keeping silent, you are going and the route of a cash transaction, okay? What could happen? Well, let's think about this, okay? If you have loan approval and you do not give written notice to the seller, and approve, I just didn't give written notice to the seller. Am I gonna have any consequences? It depends. Unapproved, no written notice, that means that now this is a cash transaction. The technicality of it is that if I'm approved by the lender, okay, and I'm approved 100%, I could proceed to closing with that loan, and I could close with the loan, okay? But the consequences are gonna depend. Why? Let's say that my closing day comes, and I'm gonna go back to one of the clauses that I discussed before, okay? My closing day comes, I am clear to close, but my bank had not sent me the closing disclosure, the day of closing. And now all of a sudden, my bank needs 3 days to close. Because I kept silent, I didn't give a written notice to the seller, right? Now I am in the middle of a cash transaction. I am gonna close with the loan, but day of closing comes, I cannot close because of the 3 days that the bank needs. Am I gonna be able to use the clause that allows the automatic extension of the contract? No, I'm not. I'm not gonna use it. I'm not gonna be able to use it. Why? Because that's a financing clause. It goes with the subject to financing, okay? So at that point, what option do I have? I am at the mercy of the seller, asking the seller to give me an extension of closing of 3, 4 days, whatever numbers of days I need. So you see how that works? I might close with the loan. I could close with the loan. I'm not saying that I'm not gonna close with the loan if I'm approved. What I'm trying to tell you is that there's certain things in the contract that might not be applicable anymore to me because of the fact that my transaction went from a transaction that was subject to financing and I had the contingency to a cash transaction. That's the first scenario, okay? Second scenario, and this one really, it doesn't have a lot of, you know, it's not that risky, but let me go over it anyways. Loan approval day comes, I don't have my final approval from the bank, but having said that, I am confident that I'm gonna get to closing and I'm gonna have my loan, right? At that day, I said, I'm not gonna get an extension of the financing period, and I do not communicate this decision to the seller, okay? I simply decide to move on. I don't say anything, and I continue with the transaction. I don't get an extension, okay? Again, silent becomes a cash transaction, okay? And now I had the risk that if I don't have the loan ready to go, I had to close cash, okay? This scenario is a little bit different. Why? Because the moment that I made that decision, at the day that I was supposed to get the extension of the loan approval period or the financing period, and I made that decision. At that moment, I took the risk that if I couldn't get the loan, I was risking my deposit if I couldn't close in cash. Okay, so that's a decision that I already made. Okay, so I made the decision when I took the risk to proceed, not because I stayed quiet. Okay, the reality of it is that even if I would say it to the seller, even if I would give written notice, it will work the same way. Because let's say that I give the written notice to the seller, okay, that I'm going to proceed. I'm already taking the risk that if the loan doesn't work, okay, I am going to close cash. However, keep this in mind. If by any chance the loan does work, okay, it does work, and I do get my loan, and I didn't give the notice in writing to the seller, then I'm in trouble. Okay, I'm in trouble because then I am I'm not gonna be able to use anything related to the financing. Okay, so always give the written notice. That's the best way, even though you're taking the risk ahead of time. And then the third option, the reality of it is that if you're not approved, okay, and you're going to cancel the transaction, at least I hope that you cancel the transaction unless you could close cash. So that one really has not a lot of relevance, okay? But for example, the one that you're approved, but you cannot meet the contingency, that one could affect the buyer, okay? If you don't cancel the transaction, okay? So this is something that we have to keep in mind, because right now we might not be in the habit of canceling the transaction because it's not the practice, okay? So in the future, if that happens, always cancel the transaction. Let me see about the question that I had before. Okay, the question that I have is from Stacy, and the question says, written notice from lender with header of the lender or from the agent. I am not sure about what section you're referring to, but in any event, the written notices that we are discussing right now are notices that the buyer has to give to the seller, okay? I do know that right now, at certain points, we have to provide, for example, in the cancellation part of it, whenever we cancel, we have to provide a denial letter, or we provide, you know, like some type of notice from the lender, okay? Whenever we're talking about the written notices here, in the various examples, the actual clauses do not say that you need to give specifically a document from the lender, okay? But having said this, you know, the fact that the ones that you're not approved, okay, the ones when you're not approved and you have, or you're approved and have a contingency that you cannot meet, there's always the good faith and diligent effort requirement. So for example, if you are approved and you haven't made you cannot meet the contingency, you always have to show that you did everything in good faith and diligent effort. So in that one, you will show the approval, the contingency, that you will have to explain that you made the efforts and that you cannot meet it. So you will have to provide that that loan approval to the seller. And the one that you're canceling because you're not approved, you will provide also the letter stating that you were not approved for the loan, which usually the lender gives it to you. Okay. Let me see if there's any other questions. But I don't think so. I don't know if there's any other questions. I know this is a bit of a change, and it could be confusing.
I was typing some of the questions when they were being asked. What I tell everybody is be patient, don't panic.
Absolutely.
You know, Title Logic and Inalvis going to all of our offices for the next couple of weeks, beginning next month, going over this contract. So, and this session is recorded. It's going to be shared in our YouTube channel, so you can watch it later if you want. You know, communication is key always with your lender and your title company, especially with this one with your lender. You got to have the right team on your side to make sure that things can be done the right way. Because otherwise, you know, we can write as many contracts as we want, but if the team behind us doesn't have our back and doesn't get things done the right way in the right time, then, you know, is when we get into trouble. So.
Absolutely. I always tell the agents as well that not only do you have to be patient, you also going to have to be doing a lot of educating other agents, you know, and updating them, believe it or not, because my experience up to this point has been that unfortunately, you know, and I hate to say this, but unfortunately, even with my colleagues, attorneys, not all of them are aware that the contract is being updated. And the same thing is going to happen with the agents. I have spoken to a bunch of agents lately, you know, because this is something that kind of like worries me, the application of all these changes and the practice of it. And the majority of the agents that are, except from the agents from Canvas, the majority of the agents that I spoke about these changes, they had no idea. So they tell me, Ina, what do you mean? Like, you know, how can you tell me that it's changing? Like, I go, yeah, absolutely. It's changing November 1st. And then I go a little bit into details and they look at me like, how is this possible? So just to give you an idea, the seminar that they were offering for attorneys, you know, and I went in order for me to prepare for these presentations and to prepare the PowerPoint, and Ernesto had to help me a lot in getting the material, you know, in getting the contracts and everything, because me as an attorney didn't have access to the actual contract. You know, I don't have access to the contract yet. So the only seminar that I have been able to find for attorneys about the modifications and the changes is happening October 28th. So we're talking about 3-4 days before the changes come into place, you know. So that goes to show you that, one, you're being prepared ahead of time, you know, so don't panic. You know, you're gonna be, before the changes come into effect, you probably have, by that time, you probably have listened to this 3 or 4 times, you know, already. And you're gonna have the material and the information and the support that you need to do that education, you know, that you and me, we're gonna have to do for other people working on these transactions, you know. So definitely don't panic, be patient, and you know, make sure you understand, make sure you ask the questions. We're here for you. That's whatever I said at the beginning, that's the reality of it. Whoever has worked with us in the past, and you know, we're here for you. That's the reality of it. Okay.
And guys, everybody, your managers and team leaders have been already had their own training sessions, so they are aware of all the changes. So you can always call your offense lead, and there will be somebody there to help you. Inalvis, thank you so very, very much, and for this great in detail presentation. Guys, if you have any other questions, Inalvis, do you want to give them your email address so they can reach you?
Yes, absolutely. The email address is a complicated one, but let me tell you. And then the other thing that you could do, if you don't have where to write right now, reach out to the branch managers. All of them have my information. Is Zubiaur. That's Z as in zebra, U as in union, B as in boy, I as in India, A as in apple, U as in union, R as in rose, Zubiaur at mytitlelogic.com. mytitlelogic.com. Okay. And if you want to write down my cell phone number is 305-815-0048. Okay. There are other changes to the contract and the addendums. I don't know. I don't know, Ernesto, if we're going to be able to discuss everything right now. Due to the time, if you want me to proceed, I'll continue.
No, I think we covered the contracts, which is the most important part, and then we'll wrap it up back again. You know, I know we have a lot of in-person classes. Make sure everybody attends their offices and participates in all of those. And then this is being recorded. It's going to be shared with everybody, and then we'll work with the team to see if we bring another one, a Spanish one. So we might reach back to you to do a Spanish one.
Yeah, no, whenever you want. You know, then the more information that you give to the agents, and the most times that they're able to listen to the material, the better for them. So anytime you guys want, you let me know. You know, I'll make sure to do.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Inalvis. Thank you for everybody participating today. And stay tuned for the next upcoming presentation on the changes to the assets contract. Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.